For more than 3,000 years, a single civilization flourished in the middle of a vast desert. Every year, the Nile River quietly overflowed its banks, leaving behind rich black soil that transformed an unforgiving landscape into one of the greatest kingdoms the world has ever known. Along its shores, towering temples reached toward the sky, enormous pyramids reflected the morning sun, and pharaohs ruled as living gods. But how did all of this begin? How did a narrow ribbon of water give birth to a civilization that would outlast nearly every empire that came after it? And what was life really like for the people who built the temples, sailed the Nile, worked the fields, and lived beneath the shadow of the pyramids? If you enjoy relaxing journeys through history and science, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, dim the lights, settle into a comfortable position, and let your imagination drift back more than 5,000 years to the banks of the Nile, where one of history's greatest civilizations was about to begin. This is the true story of ancient Egypt. Long before the first pyramid rose above the desert, before a single pharaoh wore the double crown of Egypt, and before hieroglyphs were carved into stone, this land looked very different from the Egypt we know today. If you had stood here more than 10,000 years ago, you would not have seen endless golden dunes stretching to the horizon. Instead, much of North Africa was covered with grasslands, shallow lakes, winding rivers, and scattered forests. Herds of elephants, giraffes, gazelles, and wild cattle wandered freely across a landscape that today seems almost impossible to imagine. Crocodiles basked beside rivers far from the modern Nile, while hippopotamuses rested in freshwater pools that have long since disappeared beneath the desert sands. This period is often called the African humid period, a time when seasonal rains transformed what is now the Sahara into a living landscape filled with plants, animals, and human communities. The people who lived there were hunters, gatherers, and skilled fishermen. They did not yet build cities or kingdoms. Their lives followed the rhythm of nature. Small groups moved from place to place, following migrating animals, gathering edible plants, collecting fruits and roots, and fishing in rivers and lakes that existed across much of northern Africa. Stone tools remained their most valuable possessions. Carefully shaped spear points, knives, scrapers, and axes allowed them to hunt, prepare food, and survive in an environment that, although rich with life, could still be unpredictable. These early communities left behind remarkable clues about their world. Across the Sahara, archaeologists have discovered thousands of rock paintings carved into cliffs and cave walls. Some show graceful giraffes stretching their necks toward tree branches. Others depict hunters carrying bows, cattle being herded across open grasslands, and families gathered together in daily life. Looking at these images today can feel almost surreal. They remind us that the world's largest hot desert was once a place where rivers flowed and wildlife flourished. Yet nature is never completely still. Over thousands of years, Earth's climate slowly began to change. The seasonal rains that had fed the lakes and rivers became weaker. Year after year, less water reached the land. Grasslands gradually turned dry. Lakes shrank. Rivers disappeared. Animals that had once roamed freely searched for new grazing grounds. Human communities faced a difficult choice. Some moved south toward regions where rainfall remained more reliable. Others followed the only permanent source of fresh water that never completely disappeared: the Nile. Unlike the temporary rivers scattered across the Sahara, the Nile continued flowing year after year. Fed by rainfall thousands of kilometers away in the Ethiopian highlands and the lakes of Central Africa, it carried enormous amounts of water north toward the Mediterranean Sea. Even during periods when much of North Africa grew increasingly dry, the Nile remained remarkably dependable. At first, settling beside the river may not have seemed extraordinary. Small camps appeared along its banks, much like those that had existed near other rivers for thousands of years. Families continued hunting gazelles and birds, fishing with woven nets and bone hooks, and gathering wild grains that grew naturally after the annual floods. But little by little, people noticed something remarkable. Every summer, long before anyone living along the lower Nile understood why, the river began to rise. The water slowly spread across the surrounding land, covering fields and low-lying areas beneath a shallow layer of muddy water. Weeks later, the flood quietly retreated. When it did, something extraordinary remained. A thick layer of rich black silt covered the ground. This fertile soil had traveled hundreds of kilometers from volcanic highlands far to the south. Each flood carried fresh nutrients that renewed the land without anyone needing to understand the science behind it. To the people living there, it must have seemed almost miraculous. Even after months of intense heat, the earth was ready to produce new life once again. Over generations, people began experimenting with seeds. Instead of simply collecting wild plants, they discovered that grains scattered into the freshly deposited soil often returned as larger harvests months later. Wheat and barley became increasingly important. Lentils and flax followed. Goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle gradually became part of everyday life. Hunting still mattered, but it was no longer the only way to survive. The change happened slowly. There was no single moment when people suddenly became farmers. Instead, countless small decisions, repeated over many generations, gradually transformed the relationship between humans and the land. Families stayed in one place for longer periods. Temporary camps evolved into permanent villages. Circular huts eventually gave way to more durable homes built from mud brick, reeds, and timber gathered along the riverbanks. As villages expanded, daily life also became more specialized. Not everyone needed to spend every hour searching for food anymore. Some people became skilled potters, shaping clay into jars capable of storing grain for months at a time. Others focused on weaving linen from flax fibers. Stoneworkers produced sharper tools, while experienced fishermen developed stronger boats that could travel farther along the Nile. These early boats were simple compared to those that would later sail beneath the temples of Luxor, yet they changed everything. The river was no longer just a source of water. It became a highway. Villages separated by many kilometers could now exchange food, stone, pottery, animal hides, shells, and ideas with one another. Communities that had once lived almost entirely independent lives slowly became connected by the river flowing quietly between them. This growing network encouraged cooperation. People shared farming techniques. They learned which flood levels produced the best harvests. They recognized the importance of storing surplus grain for years when the river rose too little or too much. Without realizing it, they were laying the foundations of one of history's most stable civilizations. Even during these early centuries, the Nile shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. It determined where homes could be built. It decided when crops would be planted. It influenced where animals grazed. It provided fish, drinking water, transportation, fertile soil, and a predictable rhythm that guided the passing of each year. While other regions depended heavily on uncertain rainfall, the people living beside the Nile could begin organizing their lives around something far more reliable: the river itself. And as generations continue to settle along its banks, another transformation quietly began to unfold, one that would eventually unite scattered farming villages into organized communities, and those communities into the first kingdom ancient Egypt had ever known. As these villages continued to grow, they also became increasingly connected to people living far beyond their own communities. The Nile did far more than provide water and fertile soil. It became the main road of ancient Egypt long before roads themselves existed. Small wooden boats drifted up and down the river carrying stone, pottery, food, animal skins, and ideas. What began as occasional exchanges between neighboring villages slowly developed into networks of trade that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Communities living in Upper Egypt discovered valuable resources in the south. Nubia provided gold, ivory, ebony wood, incense, and exotic animal skins that were unlike anything found farther north. Meanwhile, communities closer to the Mediterranean exchanged goods with peoples living in the Levant, receiving cedar wood, oils, and finely crafted objects that revealed entirely different traditions and technologies. Trade did more than move objects from one place to another. It carried knowledge. People observed unfamiliar pottery designs, new methods of shaping stone, different ways of constructing buildings, and more efficient tools. Over many generations, these ideas blended together, creating cultures that became increasingly sophisticated. One of the earliest of these cultures is known today as the Badarian culture, named after the region where many of its settlements were first discovered. Although these people left no written records, archaeology reveals a surprisingly advanced society. Their pottery was thin, elegant, and carefully polished. Some vessels were decorated with blackened rims produced through remarkable control of the firing process, demonstrating a level of craftsmanship that had taken generations to perfect. Their grave also tell an important story. Unlike the temporary burials of earlier hunter-gatherers, Badarian people buried their dead with care. Bodies were often placed on their sides in shallow grave, accompanied by pottery, stone tools, beads, cosmetics, and occasionally finely carved ivory objects. These possessions suggest that death was no longer viewed simply as an ending. People were beginning to believe that individuals might continue another journey beyond this life. Over time, these customs became even more elaborate. Several centuries later, another culture emerged that archaeologists call Nakada. In reality, the people themselves never used this name. It simply comes from the modern town where many important discoveries were made. Yet the influence of these communities would shape the future of Egypt in extraordinary ways. During the Nakada period, villages expanded into larger settlements. Houses became more organized. Storage buildings appeared. Workshops produced increasingly specialized goods. Copper tools, although still relatively rare, gradually joined the familiar stone implements that had served people for thousands of years. Jewelry became more refined, pottery more artistic, and carved stone vessels demonstrated remarkable precision. Perhaps even more important was the growing difference between individuals. Some grave remained simple, containing only a few everyday possessions. Others became noticeably larger. Inside them, archaeologists have discovered imported materials, finely crafted weapons, decorative palettes, ceremonial objects, and beautiful jewelry made from gold, ivory, and semi-precious stones. These discoveries suggest that society was slowly becoming more complex. Some families accumulated greater wealth and influence than others. Leaders began to emerge. At first, these leaders probably governed only a single village or a small group of neighboring communities. They organized irrigation, settled disputes, protected trade routes, and directed communal projects that required many people working together. Their authority likely depended as much on respect and experience as on military power. Religion also continued evolving. Many of the symbols that would later become familiar throughout ancient Egypt first appeared during this period. People honored animals whose strength or behavior seemed extraordinary. Falcons, cattle, crocodiles, and other creatures gradually acquired symbolic meaning. Certain locations became sacred, while ritual objects appeared with increasing frequency inside grave and ceremonial spaces. Although no great temples yet stood beside the Nile, the foundations of Egyptian religion were quietly taking shape. Art changed as well. Pottery was no longer decorated only with simple patterns. Artists began painting boats, rivers, animals, hunters, and mysterious ceremonial scenes. These images may have recorded important events, expressed religious beliefs, or celebrated powerful leaders. Whatever their purpose, they reveal a society becoming increasingly confident in its identity. As centuries passed, competition between communities intensified. Control of fertile farmland mattered. Access to trade routes mattered. Possession of valuable resources mattered. Larger settlements gradually absorbed smaller ones. Peaceful alliances sometimes united neighboring villages, while conflicts occasionally decided who controlled the surrounding land. Archaeological evidence shows that defensive walls began appearing around some settlements, suggesting that competition had become part of everyday life. By the late Naqada period, Upper Egypt in particular was changing rapidly. Several powerful regional centers, including Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and Naqada itself, expanded their influence over neighboring communities. Skilled craftsmen, priests, traders, and political leaders increasingly worked together, creating societies far more organized than the farming villages that had existed only a few centuries earlier. Without realizing it, these growing centers were preparing for something much larger. They were laying the foundations of government. They were creating the first true political territories along the Nile. And before long, those territories would begin competing not simply for fertile land or prosperous trade, but for control of the entire river itself, a struggle that would ultimately give birth to one of history's first great kingdoms and the age of the Pharaohs. For thousands of years, the Nile had quietly shaped the lives of the people who lived along its banks. Villages had become towns, trade routes had connected distant communities, and powerful regional leaders had gradually expanded their influence over neighboring settlements. By around 3200 BC, the land was no longer a collection of isolated farming villages. Two distinct kingdoms had emerged, each with its own rulers, traditions, symbols, and ambitions. To the south lay Upper Egypt. Although its name may seem confusing today, Upper Egypt was called Upper because it lay upstream, closer to the sources of the Nile. Here, the fertile valley was narrow, squeezed between steep desert cliffs that followed the river for hundreds of kilometers. Most settlements stood only a short distance from the water, creating a chain of communities connected by the Nile itself. Farther north stretched Lower Egypt. Here the river spread into countless branches before reaching the Mediterranean Sea, creating one of the largest river deltas in the ancient world. The land was flatter, greener, and filled with marshes rich in birds, fish, and papyrus reeds. The delta offered abundant farmland, but also presented different challenges. Its many waterways created natural divisions between communities, making centralized control more difficult than in the narrow southern valley. Although both regions depended on the same river, they gradually developed different identities. The rulers of Upper Egypt wore a tall white crown known today as the Hejet. Their kingdom was closely associated with the vulture goddess Nekabit, who came to symbolize royal protection and authority. In the north, the kings of Lower Egypt wore the distinctive red deseret crown. Their protector was the cobra goddess Wadjet, whose image would later appear on the royal crowns of Egyptian pharaohs for thousands of years. These differences extended beyond symbols. Each kingdom developed its own centers of power, religious traditions, and political alliances. Trade continued between north and south, but so did rivalry. Every generation saw local rulers attempting to increase their influence over neighboring territories. At first, these conflicts were probably small. Disagreements over farmland, irrigation canals, fishing grounds, or trade routes may have involved only a few villages at a time. Yet as populations grew and powerful leaders gained more followers, competition became increasingly organized. Archaeological discoveries provide remarkable evidence of this transformation. Ceremonial objects from the late pre-dynastic period depict rulers carrying maces, standards, and symbols of authority while standing before defeated enemies. Decorative stone palettes show organized groups of soldiers, fortified settlements, and prisoners captured during military campaigns. Whether these scenes represent actual battles or symbolic demonstrations of royal power remains debated, but together they reveal an important truth. Political leadership was becoming inseparable from military leadership. The strongest rulers could protect trade, defend farmland, expand their territory, and attract greater loyalty from surrounding communities. Among the southern kingdoms, one city gradually rose above the others: Abydos. Located in Upper Egypt, Abydos became one of the region's most influential political and religious centers. Its rulers controlled valuable trade routes leading farther south into Nubia, while maintaining strong connections with communities along the Nile. Nearby, another important center flourished: Hierakonpolis. Modern excavations there have uncovered workshops, ceremonial buildings, elite tombs, and extraordinary works of art that reveal a society growing richer and more complex every generation. Craftsmen produced finely carved ivory objects, ceremonial stone palettes, and beautifully decorated pottery, unlike anything created only a few centuries earlier. The wealth of these cities reflected more than successful farming. Trade now reached astonishing distances. Gold arrived from Nubia. Copper traveled from the Sinai Peninsula. Cedar wood came from the forests of the Levant. Obsidian from Ethiopia was shaped into razor-sharp blades. Lapis lazuli, originally mined thousands of kilometers away in what is now Afghanistan, eventually found its way into Egypt through vast trading networks that connected much of the ancient world. These luxury goods became powerful symbols of status. Only the wealthiest leaders could afford such rare materials, reinforcing their authority over surrounding communities. At the same time, another invention was quietly changing Egyptian society: administration. As settlements grew larger, leaders needed reliable ways to organize food supplies, labor, and trade. Grain had to be collected after harvests. Livestock needed counting. Valuable goods required protection and distribution. Long before formal writing fully developed, people began marking pottery jars, storage containers, and trade goods with simple symbols identifying ownership or origin. These marks may appear insignificant today, yet they represent one of humanity's earliest steps toward written communication. Each symbol reduced the need to rely entirely on memory. Information could now travel with the object itself. As more goods moved between communities, keeping accurate records became increasingly important. Small administrative practices that began with pottery markings would eventually evolve into one of history's most sophisticated writing systems. Meanwhile, religion continued strengthening the authority of local rulers. The leaders of Upper Egypt were no longer viewed simply as successful warriors or skilled organizers. Increasingly, they were seen as individuals chosen by divine powers to maintain harmony between humanity and nature. Successful harvests, predictable floods, and military victories all reinforced the belief that supernatural forces favored particular rulers. The connection between political authority and divine approval would later become one of the defining characteristics of Egyptian civilization. By the end of the 4th millennium BC, Upper Egypt possessed several advantages. Its settlements were more tightly connected by the narrow Nile Valley. Its rulers had gained considerable military experience through decades of regional competition. Its trade routes brought enormous wealth from the south, and its political organization had become increasingly centralized. Everything was quietly moving toward a single moment that would transform Egyptian history forever. Soon, one ruler from the south would accomplish what no leader before him had ever achieved. He would unite the two lands beneath a single crown. And with that achievement, the age of the pharaohs would truly begin. The ruler remembered by history as the man who united Egypt is known today as Nama. Some later Egyptian records identify the first king as Menes, and for generations historians debated whether these were two different individuals or simply two names for the same ruler. Even today, the question has not been answered with complete certainty. What is clear, however, is that around 3100 BC, a powerful king from Upper Egypt succeeded in bringing the Nile Valley under a single government for the first time in history. Exactly how this happened remains one of ancient Egypt's earliest mysteries. It was probably not the result of a single battle. More likely, it was the culmination of decades of political alliances, military campaigns, marriages between powerful families, and the gradual absorption of smaller kingdoms into larger ones. By the time Nama emerged, Upper Egypt had already become the dominant power along the Nile. The final step was extending that authority into the fertile delta of Lower Egypt. One of the most remarkable objects ever discovered from this period appears to record this historic moment. Today it is known as the Nama palette. Carved from dark green siltstone and standing over 60 centimeters tall, the palette was discovered in the Temple of Horus at Hierakonpolis in 1898. Although originally created as a ceremonial object rather than an everyday tool, its carvings have become one of the most important historical records from the birth of Egyptian civilization. On one side, Nama is shown wearing the tall white crown of Upper Egypt while raising a ceremonial mace over a defeated enemy. Behind him stands an attendant carrying his sandals, while above the scene, the falcon god Horus watches over the victory. The symbolism is unmistakable. Divine authority and royal power are presented as working together. On the opposite side of the palette, Nama appears once again. This time he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt. It is one of the earliest known images showing a single ruler wearing the symbols of both lands. Whether every detail reflects an actual historical event or serves as royal propaganda is impossible to know. Yet the overall message remains unmistakable. The two lands had become one. For the first time, a single king ruled from the southern valley to the northern delta. This achievement transformed far more than politics. It changed how people understood Egypt itself. Instead of belonging only to individual villages or regional kingdoms, people gradually became part of a much larger state, stretching for nearly 1,000 kilometers along the Nile. Different communities still preserved their local traditions and temples, but they now shared a common ruler whose authority extended across the entire country. To govern such a vast territory required something completely new: organization. A royal court began coordinating the collection of grain, livestock, and labor from communities throughout the kingdom. Officials traveled along the Nile inspecting harvests, settling disputes, and communicating the king's decisions to local leaders. Instead of each region acting independently, authority increasingly flowed from a central government. The location chosen for that government was carefully considered. Near the point where Upper Egypt met Lower Egypt, a new royal capital emerged. The Egyptians called it Ineb-Hej, meaning the White Walls. Centuries later, the Greeks would know it by another name: Memphis. Its position was ideal. From Memphis, the king could reach both the narrow valley of Upper Egypt and the broad delta of Lower Egypt with relative ease. Boats traveling north or south naturally passed through this strategic region, making it the perfect administrative center for the newly united kingdom. As the capital expanded, so did the institutions that supported royal authority. Specialized officials began supervising agriculture, irrigation, construction, and trade. Scribes carefully recorded deliveries of grain, livestock, oils, linen, and other valuable goods entering royal storehouses. These records allowed the government to plan for years when the Nile flooded poorly and harvests became smaller. Writing itself also advanced rapidly during this period. The simple ownership marks used by earlier communities gradually evolved into recognizable hieroglyphic symbols. At first, these signs were used primarily for administration rather than storytelling. They identified names, places, quantities, and royal possessions. Clay ceilings attached to jars and storage rooms protected valuable supplies, while also identifying their contents. These early records may seem ordinary today, yet they represented one of humanity's greatest inventions. For the first time, information no longer depended entirely on memory. Knowledge could be stored, transferred, verified, and preserved for future generations. The king's authority also became increasingly connected with religion. Earlier leaders had claimed the support of local gods. Now the ruler of Egypt was presented as the earthly representative of Horus himself. This belief gave political authority a sacred dimension, unlike anything most neighboring societies possessed. Obeying the king was no longer simply a matter of loyalty to a human ruler. It became part of maintaining the natural order established by the gods. This idea would eventually develop into one of the central principles of Egyptian civilization. Mad. Although the concept reached its fullest expression centuries later, its foundations were already emerging during Egypt's earliest dynasties. Ma'at represented truth, justice, harmony, and balance. Egyptians believed the universe functioned properly only when this divine order was preserved. The annual flooding of the Nile, successful harvests, peaceful society, and the stability of the kingdom were all understood as signs that Ma'at remained intact. The king's greatest responsibility was therefore not simply ruling the country. It was protecting the balance of the entire world. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued along the river much as it always had. Farmers still watched the Nile rise and fall. Fishermen still cast their nets into quiet waters. Potters shaped clay beneath the warm Egyptian sun. Children grew up beside fields of barley and wheat. Yet beneath these familiar routines, something extraordinary had changed. For the first time, millions of individual moments of daily life were becoming part of a single civilization. People living hundreds of kilometers apart now belonged to the same kingdom, served the same ruler, and gradually shared the same symbols, traditions, and identity. Without realizing it, they were entering one of history's most remarkable periods of stability. The foundations had been laid. The river had given birth to a nation. Its rulers had united the two lands. Its government had begun taking shape. Its writing system had started recording history itself. Now those same rulers would turn their attention toward something no civilization had ever attempted before. They would begin building monuments not for years, or even centuries, but for eternity. And rising above the western desert, they would leave behind structures so extraordinary that they would continue to dominate the horizon more than 4,000 years later. The age of the pyramids was about to begin. For nearly 3 centuries after the unification of Egypt, each generation of kings inherited a kingdom that had become stronger than the one before it. Villages had grown into prosperous towns, trade flowed steadily along the Nile, and royal authority reached farther than ever before. Yet one challenge remained. Every ruler wanted to leave behind a monument greater than those of his predecessors. A king's tomb was not simply a place of burial. It was a declaration that his reign would continue forever. As each new generation looked back at the achievements of those who came before, the desire to build something larger, stronger, and more enduring steadily grew. The first ruler to transform that ambition into reality was Djoser, the second king of Egypt's third dynasty. Although many kings before him had strengthened the kingdom, Djoser would become remembered for something entirely different. He would forever change the way Egyptians built. the way they honored their rulers, and the way the world remembered ancient Egypt. When Djoser came to the throne around 2670 BC, Egyptian kings were still buried inside large rectangular tombs known as mastabas. These structures were built from mud brick and stood above underground burial chambers. For centuries, mastabas had served Egypt's rulers well. They protected the king's body, provided space for offerings, and symbolized the beginning of eternal life. But they had one obvious weakness. Mud brick could not last forever. Wind slowly wore it away. Rain, although rare, damaged its walls. Time itself gradually erased the monuments of earlier generations. Djoser wanted something different. He wanted a tomb that would survive for eternity. To achieve that goal, he turned to one of the most extraordinary individuals in Egyptian history. His name was Imhotep. Unlike most officials whose names disappeared into history, Imhotep became famous for thousands of years after his death. Later Egyptians admired him so deeply that they eventually worshipped him as a god of wisdom and medicine. Greek writers compared him to their own god of healing, Asclepius. Yet during Djoser's reign, Imhotep was a very real person, a royal architect, high priest, administrator, engineer, and scholar whose influence reached almost every part of the kingdom. Imhotep understood something few builders before him had fully appreciated. Stone could outlive generations. While mud bricks slowly returned to dust, limestone remained standing century after century. Egypt possessed enormous limestone deposits only a short distance from Memphis. For generations, these quarries had supplied small amounts of stone for temples, statues, and ceremonial buildings. Imhotep imagined something far more ambitious. What if an entire royal monument could be built from stone? The idea itself was revolutionary. No civilization had ever attempted construction on such a scale using carefully cut limestone blocks. Every technique had to be developed almost from the beginning. The chosen location lay on the desert plateau of Saqqara, west of Memphis. The site overlooked the fertile Nile Valley below while remaining safely above the reach of the annual floods. It had already served as a royal cemetery for generations, making it the perfect place for Egypt's boldest architectural experiment. Construction began with what appeared to be an ordinary mastaba. Workers leveled the bedrock, marked precise foundations, and began placing enormous limestone blocks one after another. Unlike rough fieldstones used in earlier buildings, these blocks were carefully shaped so that they fit together with remarkable precision. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of finishing the mastaba, Imhotep expanded it. A second layer was added above the first, then another, and another. Each level became slightly smaller than the one beneath it. Gradually, the familiar rectangular tomb transformed into something the world had never seen before, a giant staircase rising toward the sky. Today we know it as the Step Pyramid of Djoser. Standing more than 60 meters high, it became the tallest structure ever built by human hands. For people living at that time, the sight must have been astonishing. Nothing in Egypt, or anywhere else, had ever reached such a height. The monument dominated the horizon from many kilometers away. Travelers approaching Memphis would have seen its bright limestone surface reflecting the sunlight long before reaching the city itself. Yet the pyramid represented only one part of a much larger project. Around it, Imhotep designed an enormous ceremonial complex covering nearly 15 hectares. High limestone walls enclosed courtyards, Temples, shrines, storage rooms, ceremonial gateways, and ritual spaces intended to serve the king for all eternity. Many of these buildings were carved from stone, but deliberately imitated earlier structures that had once been built from reeds, timber, and mud brick. Columns resembled bundled reeds. Stone ceilings copied wooden beams. Doorways reproduced architectural details that had originally belonged to temporary buildings. It was as though Egypt's past had been frozen forever in stone. Every detail carried symbolic meaning. The pyramid itself may have represented the primeval mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of creation, according to Egyptian belief. Others suggest its ascending steps symbolize the king's journey toward the heavens, allowing him to join the eternal gods among the stars. Whatever the original intention, one message was unmistakable. This was no ordinary tomb. It was a monument built to last forever. Constructing such an enormous complex required an organization unlike anything Egypt had attempted before. Thousands of workers participated over many years. But contrary to one of history's most persistent myths, these workers were not chained slaves forced to labor under brutal conditions. Most were ordinary Egyptians fulfilling seasonal labor obligations to the state. Every summer, the Nile flooded the surrounding farmland. For several months, fields disappeared beneath water, making agriculture temporarily impossible. Rather than allowing thousands of able workers to remain idle, the government organized them into construction crews. This system benefited everyone. Farmers continued receiving food supplied from royal granaries. The state completed massive building projects. Workers acquired valuable skills in quarrying, transport, and stone cutting. Entire communities participated in creating monuments that symbolized both royal authority and national unity. The organization behind these projects was astonishing. Royal officials calculated food supplies months in advance. Scribes carefully recorded deliveries of grain, beer, onions, dried fish, and bread distributed to each work crew. Specialized craftsmen supervised teams of stonecutters, surveyors, transport workers, rope makers, carpenters, and tool manufacturers. Without a sophisticated government, none of it would have been possible. The step pyramid was not simply an architectural achievement. It demonstrated something equally important. Egypt had become capable of coordinating thousands of people toward a single goal. That ability would soon allow its rulers to dream even bigger, much bigger. Djoser's step pyramid transformed the ambitions of every king who followed him. It proved that stone could be shaped into monuments unlike anything the ancient world had ever imagined. Yet to later rulers, even this extraordinary achievement became only the beginning. If one king could build a monument 60 meters high, perhaps another could build something even greater. The man who accepted that challenge was Sneferu, the founder of Egypt's fourth dynasty. Few pharaohs influenced Egyptian architecture as profoundly as Sneferu. Although his son Khufu would eventually receive much of the world's attention, it was Sneferu who spent decades solving the engineering problems that made the Great Pyramid possible. Unlike earlier kings who built only a single royal monument, Sneferu launched several enormous pyramid projects during his reign. Each one taught Egyptian builders valuable lessons about weight distribution, stone placement, structural stability, and large-scale organization. His first major pyramid stood at Meidum. Construction probably began under the previous king, Huni, before Snefru expanded the project dramatically. Originally designed as a step pyramid, it was later modified into what builders hoped would become Egypt's first smooth-sided pyramid. The idea was ambitious. Instead of visible steps, workers filled the spaces between each level with additional masonry, creating smooth outer faces that rose toward a single point. For a time, the design appeared successful. But centuries later, much of its outer structure collapsed. Today, only its tall central core remains standing, giving it the appearance of a massive stone tower rising from the desert. Historians still debate exactly when the collapse occurred. It may have happened during construction, shortly after completion, or long after the pyramid had already stood for generations. Whatever the cause, one lesson became clear. Building larger monuments required entirely new engineering techniques. Snefru did not abandon his dream. Instead, construction began again at a new location called Darsha. There, Egyptian architects attempted another smooth-sided pyramid. This structure would later become famous as the Bent Pyramid. At first, everything proceeded according to plan. The pyramid rose steadily from the desert floor, with sides inclined at approximately 54 degrees. Then, somewhere around halfway through construction, something unexpected happened. The builders noticed warning signs. Small cracks appeared within the internal chambers. The enormous weight pressing downward threatened the stability of the structure. Rather than ignoring the danger, the architects made an extraordinary decision. They changed the angle. The upper portion of the pyramid continued rising, but at a much gentler slope of approximately 43 degrees. The sudden change created the distinctive bent appearance that still gives the monument its modern name. Although unusual in shape, the bent pyramid represents one of history's greatest engineering successes. Instead of allowing the structure to fail, Egyptian builders adapted while construction was still underway. They learned, they improved, and they continued experimenting. Soon afterward, Snefru ordered yet another pyramid. Also located at Darsha, this monument became known as the Red Pyramid, named after the reddish limestone visible today. This time, builders applied everything they had learned. The pyramid maintained the safer lower angle from the very beginning. Its internal chambers distributed weight more effectively. Its foundations were carefully prepared. The result was remarkable. The Red Pyramid became the first true successful smooth-sided pyramid in history. Standing approximately 105 meters high, it remained among the tallest structures on Earth for centuries. More importantly, it proved that Egypt had mastered the engineering principles necessary to construct even larger monuments. By the end of Snefru's reign, pyramid building was no longer an experiment. It had become a science. Surveyors understood how to align massive structures with astonishing precision. Stonecutters developed increasingly efficient methods for shaping limestone blocks. Transport crews refined techniques for moving enormous stones across the desert using wooden sledges, ropes, rollers, and carefully prepared pathways. Administrators organized thousands of workers with remarkable efficiency. Every failed attempt had become a lesson. Every success inspired even greater confidence. When Snefru died, he left behind something far more valuable than three enormous pyramids. He left behind knowledge. His son, Khufu, inherited not only the throne, but also the experience gathered through decades of experimentation. Khufu understood exactly what those achievements made possible. If his father had built the first successful smooth pyramid, he would build the greatest pyramid the world had ever seen. The chosen site lay on the limestone plateau of Giza, overlooking the fertile Nile valley below. Unlike Saqqara, Giza offered a vast, stable foundation of solid bedrock capable of supporting an unimaginably heavy structure. Surveyors spent months measuring the ground with extraordinary precision. Even today, the Great Pyramid's alignment with the cardinal directions differs from true north by only a tiny fraction of a degree, a level of accuracy that continues to impress modern engineers. The project demanded resources on an unprecedented scale. Millions of limestone blocks would eventually be required. Most came from nearby quarries, only a short distance from the construction site. Higher quality white limestone used for the outer casing arrived by boat from the quarries at Tura, across the Nile. Granite weighing up to 70 tons traveled hundreds of kilometers downstream from Aswan, where skilled workers carved the enormous blocks from solid rock before transporting them along the river. For generations, people imagined that such work could only have been completed by armies of enslaved laborers. Modern archaeology tells a very different story. Near Giza, excavations have uncovered the remains of carefully planned workers' villages. These settlements contained bakeries, breweries, kitchens, workshops, medical facilities, and sleeping quarters capable of supporting thousands of laborers. Animal bones recovered from the site reveal diets rich in beef, sheep, goat, and fish. Workers received bread and beer every day, along with meat during important periods of construction. Evidence of healed, broken bones suggests that injured laborers often received medical treatment rather than being abandoned. Many of the people who built the pyramids were highly skilled specialists. Stone masons, surveyors, carpenters, boat builders, engineers, rope makers, metal workers. Others were seasonal laborers serving the state during the Nile flood, just as earlier generations had done under Djoser and Sneferu. Each group played an essential role. No single individual could build a pyramid. Only an entire civilization working together could accomplish such a task. As construction advanced year after year, the Great Pyramid slowly rose above the Giza Plateau. From every direction, travelers approaching Egypt could see its brilliant white limestone casing reflecting sunlight across the desert. For many kilometers, it must have appeared almost luminous against the surrounding landscape. Nothing anywhere on Earth compared to it. And yet, even as Khufu's monument continued rising toward the sky, Egyptian builders had not reached the end of their ambitions. The greatest pyramid in history would soon become part of something even larger, an entire royal landscape that would define ancient Egypt forever. By the time Khufu's Great Pyramid was completed, Egypt had accomplished something no civilization had ever achieved before. Rising nearly 150 meters into the sky, it remained the tallest structure on Earth for almost 4,000 years. Its smooth white limestone casing reflected the Egyptian sun so brilliantly that travelers approaching the Nile could see it from many kilometers away. Yet for the people who built it, the pyramid was never meant to stand alone. It formed part of a carefully planned royal landscape that expressed the pharaoh's power, his connection to the gods, and his journey into eternity. When Khufu died, his son Khafa inherited not only the throne, but also the responsibility of continuing this extraordinary tradition. Rather than trying to surpass his father's pyramid in height, Kaffa focused on creating a monumental complex that blended architecture, religion, and landscape into a single vision. His pyramid, although slightly smaller than Khufu's, stands on higher ground, creating the illusion that it is even taller. This careful choice of location demonstrates how deeply Egyptian architects understood perspective thousands of years before the science of optics was ever studied. Like his father's monument, Kaffa's pyramid originally shone beneath a smooth layer of polished white limestone. Even today, small sections of that casing remain near its summit, offering a rare glimpse of how the pyramids once appeared. Modern visitors often imagine the pyramids as rough, sandy stone structures, but for the ancient Egyptians, they were dazzling monuments whose brilliant surfaces reflected the changing light from sunrise until sunset. Kaffa's pyramid complex followed a carefully organized design. A magnificent valley temple stood near the edge of the cultivated land beside the Nile. From there, a long stone causeway stretched upward across the plateau toward the mortuary temple built beside the pyramid itself. Every stage of the king's funeral journey followed this sacred route. Priests, officials, and mourners would have accompanied the royal body through these monumental spaces before it finally entered the burial chamber deep within the pyramid. The valley temple itself was unlike anything built before. Constructed from enormous blocks of limestone and lined with polished red granite imported from Aswan, its interior reflected remarkable craftsmanship. Massive stone pillars supported heavy ceilings, while carefully fitted blocks created smooth walls without the use of mortar. Sunlight entered only through limited openings, producing a quiet atmosphere that emphasized the sacred nature of the building. Nearby stood another monument that would become one of history's greatest mysteries, the Great Sphinx. Carved directly from a natural limestone outcrop, the Sphinx measures approximately 73 meters in length and 20 meters in height. It combines the body of a reclining lion with the face of a king, almost certainly representing Kaffa himself. Facing directly toward the rising sun, the monument has watched over the Giza Plateau for more than 4,500 years. Its exact purpose continues to fascinate historians. Some believe it served as a guardian protecting the royal necropolis. Others see it as a symbol of royal strength and divine authority. Still others connect it with the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky reflected ideas of rebirth and eternal life. Whatever its original meaning, the Sphinx became one of the most recognizable symbols of ancient Egypt. Even during antiquity, drifting desert sand repeatedly buried much of the monument. Several later pharaohs ordered excavations to uncover it once again. One of them, Thutmose IV, even placed a large granite stele between the Sphinx's paws, describing a dream in which the monument promised him the throne if he cleared away the surrounding sand. The story reveals something remarkable. The Sphinx was already considered an ancient monument more than 1,000 years after it had been carved. Following Kaffa's reign, another king continued the monumental building program at Giza. Menkaure, the grandson of Khufu, constructed the third and smallest of the Great Pyramids. Although considerably smaller than those of his father and grandfather, Menkaure's pyramid demonstrated exceptional craftsmanship. Its lower courses were faced with polished red granite, while the upper sections used brilliant white limestone, creating an elegant contrast unlike any other pyramid at Giza. His funerary complex also included beautifully carved statues depicting the king standing beside the goddess Hathor and the protective deities of different Egyptian provinces. These sculptures reveal a level of artistic realism that had continued developing alongside Egypt's architectural achievements. By now, the Giza Plateau had become far more than a collection of royal tombs. It had become an entire sacred city dedicated to eternity. Smaller pyramids belonging to queens surrounded the great monuments. Mastaba tombs belonging to royal officials, priests, architects, engineers, and members of the royal family gradually filled the surrounding landscape. Every individual buried there hoped that resting close to the king would strengthen their own journey into the afterlife. Construction on such an enormous scale demanded astonishing levels of organization. Every year, thousands of workers arrived during the Nile flood, when farming temporarily stopped beneath the rising waters. Skilled administrators carefully divided labor into specialized teams. Some quarried limestone from nearby cliffs, others transporting blocks using sledges pulled across carefully prepared tracks. Stone masons shaped each block with extraordinary precision, while surveyors constantly checked measurements to ensure every course remained perfectly aligned. Food for these workers came from across the kingdom. Royal granaries supplied enormous quantities of grain. State bakeries produced thousands of loaves of bread every day. Breweries prepared beer that served as both nourishment and payment. Large herds of cattle, sheep, and goats were raised specifically to feed the labor force. Without the wealth generated by the Nile's fertile harvests, projects on this scale would have been impossible. The pyramids therefore represented far more than engineering. They reflected the strength of Egypt's entire economy. Every successful harvest, every carefully recorded tax, every boat carrying limestone downstream, every craftsman shaping copper tools, every farmer harvesting grain beside the Nile. Together, they made these monuments possible. And while later generations would remember the pyramids as symbols of mysterious ancient kings, the Egyptians themselves saw something different. They saw proof that order, cooperation, and stability could achieve what no individual ever could. Yet beneath this remarkable age of prosperity, subtle changes were already beginning to appear. The enormous wealth required to support these projects could not continue forever. Over the generations, royal authority would gradually weaken, local governors would grow increasingly powerful, and the kingdom that had reached such extraordinary heights would eventually face its first great crisis. For generations, the pyramids had stood as visible proof of the pharaoh's absolute authority. They dominated the western horizon, reminding every traveler that Egypt possessed a ruler powerful enough to command tens of thousands of people and resources from across the entire kingdom. Yet no civilization remains unchanged forever. The very success that had allowed the old kingdom to flourish would gradually create new challenges, and over time those challenges began reshaping Egypt in unexpected ways. One of the most important changes happened quietly. As each pharaoh rewarded loyal officials for their service, local governors gained increasing responsibility over different regions of the country. These officials, known today as nomarchs, supervised agriculture, collected taxes, organized irrigation projects, settled disputes, and represented the king throughout Egypt. In the beginning, they served entirely at the Pharaoh's command. But generation after generation, many of these positions became hereditary. Sons inherited the offices once held by their fathers. Power that had originally belonged to the king slowly became concentrated in influential families scattered across the Nile Valley. At the same time, Egypt itself continued growing. Its population increased. New farmland was cultivated. Trade expanded farther into Nubia, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Levant. Managing such a large kingdom became increasingly complicated. Communication depended entirely on boats traveling along the Nile. Messages that today could be delivered in seconds required days or even weeks to reach distant provinces. The farther local governors lived from the royal court, the more independently they often ruled. Nature also played its part. For countless generations, Egyptians had trusted the annual flood of the Nile. Its arrival was so dependable that entire calendars were built around it. Yet the river was never completely predictable. Modern scientific studies suggest that during the late Old Kingdom, several years of unusually weak flooding may have reduced harvests across large parts of Egypt. Without enough water, fertile fields produced less grain. Food became scarcer. Local communities relied increasingly on emergency supplies stored in regional granaries. For ordinary farmers, these difficult years would have been deeply unsettling. The Nile had always represented stability. When the river failed to behave as expected, people naturally searched for explanations. Many believed the king's relationship with the gods ensured the proper balance of the universe. If the floods became weaker, if harvests failed, if famine spread, some inevitably questioned whether the pharaoh still possessed divine favor. No single event brought the Old Kingdom to an end. Instead, its decline unfolded gradually over several generations. Each challenge reinforced the next. Regional governors became more powerful. Royal authority weakened. Economic pressures increased. Large state-building projects became increasingly difficult to sustain. By the reign of Pepi II, these problems had become especially significant. Pepi II occupies a unique place in Egyptian history. According to later historical traditions, he may have ruled for more than 90 years, making him one of the longest reigning monarchs ever recorded. Although modern historians debate the exact length of his reign, there is little doubt that he governed Egypt for an exceptionally long time. At first, such stability might seem beneficial, but an unusually long reign created unexpected difficulties. Several generations of officials served under the same aging king. Powerful families established themselves throughout the provinces. By the time Pepi II died, many local rulers possessed authority that rivaled the central government itself. Without a strong successor capable of immediately restoring control, Egypt entered one of the most uncertain periods in its early history. Historians call it the First Intermediate Period. For centuries, many scholars described this era as complete chaos. Modern archaeology paints a more balanced picture. The central government certainly weakened. Some regions experienced conflict. Trade declined in certain areas. Royal building projects nearly disappeared. Yet daily life did not simply stop. Farmers still planted crops. Fishermen still cast their nets into the Nile. Potters continued shaping clay. Children still grew up beside the river. Life carried on, even as political authority became fragmented. Instead of one powerful king ruling the entire country, several regional leaders competed for influence. Different cities attempted to establish themselves as centers of power. Some controlled Upper Egypt, others dominated parts of the Delta. The unity that Nama had achieved centuries earlier gradually disappeared. Yet even during this divided age, one remarkable idea survived. The idea of Egypt itself. People continued believing that the two lands belonged together. The concept of a united kingdom had become deeply rooted in Egyptian identity. Although rival rulers fought for control, none claimed that Egypt should remain permanently divided. Each believed that they should become the one true ruler of all Egypt. Eventually, that ruler emerged. From the southern city of Thebes, a king named Mentuhotep II gradually defeated his rivals and reunited the country around 2055 BC. His victory marked the beginning of what historians call the Middle Kingdom. For Egyptians, it represented something even more important, a second beginning. The mistakes of the Old Kingdom had not been forgotten. Future rulers understood that concentrating all wealth into monumental tombs while allowing regional governors to become increasingly independent carried serious risks. The focus of government slowly began to change. Rather than building ever larger pyramids, kings invested more heavily in strengthening administration, improving irrigation systems, expanding agriculture, protecting trade routes, and securing Egypt's borders. The pharaoh remained a divine ruler, but the government itself became more practical, more organized, and better prepared to manage a growing nation. The lessons learned from the collapse of the Old Kingdom shaped every dynasty that followed. Egypt had discovered that even the greatest civilization in the world could not survive through monuments alone. Its true strength had always come from something much simpler: the steady rhythm of the Nile, the dedication of its people, and the ability to adapt whenever the world around them began to change. Those qualities would soon be tested once again, because beyond Egypt's eastern frontier, new peoples were watching. New technologies were spreading across the ancient Near East, and before long, strangers unlike any Egypt had faced before would cross its borders, bringing with them weapons, horses, and ideas that would transform the kingdom forever. The reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II marked the beginning of a new chapter in the country's history. The wounds left by years of political division slowly healed, and once again the Nile flowed through a single kingdom. Yet the rulers of the Middle Kingdom understood something their predecessors had learned the hard way. A stable Egypt required more than magnificent monuments. It required careful administration, secure borders, productive farmland, and a government capable of responding to change. Over the next several centuries, Egypt entered another long period of prosperity. Kings strengthened irrigation systems that allowed farmers to cultivate larger areas of fertile land. New canals helped control the annual floodwaters, while state officials carefully monitored harvests and stored grain for years when the Nile rose less than expected. Trade expanded farther south into Nubia, bringing gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals into Egypt. To the northeast, merchants exchanged goods with cities in the Levant, returning with cedar wood, oils, wine, and finely crafted luxury items. The Middle Kingdom also witnessed remarkable cultural growth. Literature flourished. Stories, poems, religious texts, and wisdom writings became increasingly popular among Egypt's educated scribes. Some of the country's most famous works, including the Tale of Sinew and the Eloquent Peasant, were written during this period. These texts reveal that Egyptians were interested not only in kings and gods, but also in justice, loyalty, family, and the struggles of ordinary people. For nearly 400 years, Egypt once again appeared strong and secure. But beyond its northeastern frontier, history was beginning to change. Across the ancient Near East, populations were constantly moving in search of farmland, trade opportunities, and safer places to live. Some traveled peacefully as merchants or shepherds. Others arrived seeking work or protection during difficult times in their own homelands. Among these newcomers were groups that the Egyptians would later call the Hyksos. The name itself means rulers of foreign lands. For many years, these people settled gradually in the eastern Nile Delta. At first, they were not invading armies. Many lived peacefully among the Egyptian population, bringing with them new customs, languages, and technologies. They traded with local communities, raised families, and became part of the diverse population living in northern Egypt. Over time, however, the political situation changed. As the authority of the later Middle Kingdom weakened, local rulers struggled to maintain control over distant regions. The Hyksos steadily increased their influence until they eventually established their own kingdom in the Delta, with its capital at Avaris. For the first time in centuries, much of northern Egypt was ruled by foreign kings. This was a profound shock. The Egyptians had long believed that their pharaoh maintained order throughout the world. Seeing outsiders rule part of their homeland challenged that belief in ways no previous generation had experienced. Yet the Hyksos brought more than political change. They introduced technologies that would permanently transform Egyptian warfare. Perhaps the most important was the horse. Although horses were already known elsewhere, they had never played a major role in Egyptian military life. The Hyksos used them to pull light, fast war chariots that could move quickly across open ground. Compared with soldiers fighting only on foot, these chariots offered enormous advantages in speed, mobility, and battlefield coordination. The Egyptians also encountered new types of weapons. Composite bows, built from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, fired arrows farther and with greater power than the simple self-bows traditionally used along the Nile. Improved bronze weapons, stronger armor, and more advanced military tactics gradually appeared as well. Rather than rejecting these foreign innovations, the Egyptians did something remarkably practical. They learned from them. Instead of viewing every foreign idea as a threat, Egyptian craftsmen carefully studied Hyksos technology. Chariot construction, horse breeding, bronze working, and military organization slowly spread throughout Upper Egypt. Sometimes civilizations become stronger not by resisting change, but by adapting to it. While the Hyksos ruled the north, native Egyptian kings continued governing Upper Egypt from the city of Thebes. For several generations, an uneasy balance existed. Neither side completely controlled the country. Trade continued. Diplomacy continued. But beneath the surface, tension steadily increased. Eventually, one Theban ruler decided that Egypt should once again become a single kingdom. His name was Seqenenetau. Ancient records suggest that he fought directly against the Hyksos, although the details remain uncertain. His mummy, discovered thousands of years later, bears several severe head wounds believed by many scholars to have been inflicted during battle. Whether he died fighting or was executed after capture remains unknown. His struggle was continued by his son, Kamos. Kamos launched military campaigns farther north, attacking Hyksos strongholds and disrupting their control of the delta. His inscriptions describe Egypt divided between foreign rulers in the north and Nubian kingdoms in the south, with his own territory trapped between them. Determined to restore Egyptian independence, he declared that such a situation could not continue. Although Kamos achieved important victories, he died before completing his mission. The task would fall to his younger brother, a king whose victories would forever change Egyptian history. His name was Ahmose. Under Ahmose, the Egyptian army became something entirely different from the forces that had existed during the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Soldiers now fought beside horse-drawn chariots. Composite bows gave Egyptian archers greater range and power. Military commanders coordinated campaigns with increasing discipline and organization. After a series of determined campaigns, Ahmose captured Avaris, the Hyksos capital. The foreign rulers retreated into southern Canaan, pursued by Egyptian forces determined to prevent another invasion. For the first time in more than a century, Egypt stood united once again. But something fundamental had changed. The experience of foreign occupation had taught the Egyptians an unforgettable lesson. Waiting for enemies to arrive at their borders was no longer enough. If Egypt wished to remain secure, it would have to project its power beyond the Nile Valley itself. That realization would soon give birth to an empire unlike anything Egypt had ever known. Ahmose had reunited Egypt, but his greatest achievement was not simply driving the Hyksos from the Nile Delta. He transformed the way Egypt viewed the world. For centuries, the kingdom had focused almost entirely on protecting the fertile lands along the Nile. Now the pharaohs realized that lasting security required controlling the lands beyond their borders. If powerful enemies were allowed to grow in neighboring regions, another invasion might one day threaten Egypt again. This new way of thinking gave birth to the New Kingdom, the most powerful era in Egyptian history. Its rulers no longer saw themselves merely as kings defending the Nile. They became conquerors, diplomats, builders, and emperors whose influence stretched far beyond Egypt itself. Among the first to strengthen this expanding kingdom was Hatshepsut, one of the most remarkable rulers of the ancient world. Her path to power was anything but ordinary. After the death of her husband, Thutmose II, the throne legally belonged to the young Prince Thutmose III, who was still a child. Hatshepsut initially ruled as regent, governing on behalf of the young king. But over time, she assumed full royal authority and declared herself pharaoh. For many civilizations of the ancient world, this would have been almost unthinkable. Yet Hatshepsut carefully presented herself according to Egyptian tradition. In official statues and reliefs, she often appeared wearing the royal kilt, the ceremonial false beard, and the crowns traditionally associated with male pharaohs. These were not attempts to hide her identity, but to demonstrate that the office of pharaoh stood above gender. What mattered was maintaining Ma'at, the divine order that preserved harmony throughout Egypt. Rather than spending her reign pursuing constant warfare, Hatshepsut focused on prosperity. She restored temples neglected during earlier conflicts. She strengthened trade. She launched ambitious construction projects across the country. Her greatest architectural achievement still stands today at Deir el-Bahri, near modern Luxor. Built against towering limestone cliffs on the west bank of the Nile, her mortuary temple remains one of the masterpieces of ancient architecture. Wide terraces rise gracefully above one another, connected by broad ramps and lined with elegant colonnades. Instead of dominating the landscape like the pyramids of Giza, the temple blends naturally into the cliffs behind it, creating one of the most beautiful monuments ever built in ancient Egypt. But perhaps Hatshepsut's most famous achievement took place far from Egypt itself. Ancient inscriptions describe an extraordinary expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. Its exact location remains uncertain even today, though many historians believe it lay somewhere along the Red Sea coast, possibly in modern Eritrea, Somalia, or eastern Sudan. Unlike military campaigns, this was a peaceful trading mission. Large Egyptian ships sailed south, carrying manufactured goods, while returning with treasures rarely seen in the Nile Valley. They brought back fragrant myrrh trees with their roots still wrapped in baskets of soil, so they could be planted in Egyptian temple gardens. They returned with incense, ebony wood, ivory, gold, exotic animals, leopard skins, and rare plants that amazed those waiting on the docks. Reliefs carved inside Hatshepsut's temple still record the journey in remarkable detail. For Egypt, wealth did not always arrive through conquest. Sometimes it arrived through curiosity, diplomacy, and trade. Yet while Hatshepsut's peaceful policies strengthened the kingdom, another ruler was preparing to transform Egypt into the greatest military power of its age. That ruler was Thutmose III. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III finally ruled alone. History would remember him as one of Egypt's greatest generals. During his reign, he led at least 17 military campaigns into Syria and Canaan, extending Egyptian influence farther than ever before. His first great challenge came at the city of Megiddo. Several local rulers had united in rebellion against Egyptian authority. Rather than waiting for them to attack, Thutmose marched north with his army. As his forces approached Megiddo, his commanders recommended taking one of two safer roads that led toward the city. Thutmose rejected their advice. Instead, he chose the narrow mountain pass that his enemies believed no army would dare attempt. The route was dangerous. If the Egyptians had been ambushed while passing through the confined valley, the campaign might have ended in disaster. But the gamble succeeded. Emerging unexpectedly from the pass, Thutmose caught the coalition by surprise. The enemy retreated behind the walls of Megiddo, allowing the Egyptians to surround the city. Although the siege lasted several months, Egypt eventually secured victory. The Battle of Megiddo is often considered one of the earliest military campaigns described in remarkable historical detail. Official inscriptions carved into the walls of Karnak temple record not only the victory itself, but also lists of captured weapons, horses, chariots, livestock, and valuable goods. Following Megiddo, Egyptian armies continued campaigning throughout the Levant. Rather than destroying every conquered city, Thutmose often adopted a more practical strategy. Local rulers who accepted Egyptian authority were allowed to remain in power. They paid tribute, supplied troops when required, and recognized the supremacy of the pharaoh. Some even sent their sons to Egypt. There, these young princes were educated within the royal court. They learned the Egyptian language, religion, and political traditions before eventually returning home as loyal allies. It was an extraordinarily effective system. Influence sometimes proved stronger than occupation. As Egypt's empire expanded, enormous wealth flowed into the Nile Valley. Gold from Nubia, silver from Asia, fine horses, precious woods, wine, copper, luxury textiles, rare animals. The temples grew richer. Royal workshops became busier than ever. Artists, sculptors, architects, and scribes found constant work supporting an empire that stretched farther than any previous Egyptian ruler had imagined. Nowhere was this prosperity more visible than at Karnak. Generation after generation, pharaohs expanded this vast temple complex dedicated primarily to the god Ammon. Towering pylons marked monumental entrances. Forests of stone columns rose toward the sky. Obelisks carved from single blocks of granite celebrated royal victories. Walls became covered with reliefs recording military campaigns, religious ceremonies, and offerings to the gods. Karnak was far more than a temple. It became the spiritual heart of the Egyptian empire. For ordinary Egyptians, life remained closely tied to the rhythms of the Nile. Farmers continued planting and harvesting according to the annual flood. Craftsmen filled workshops producing pottery, furniture, jewelry, and linen. Merchants traded goods arriving from every corner of the expanding empire. Yet many people understood that their kingdom had entered a new age. Egypt was no longer simply the civilization of the Nile. It had become one of the great powers of the ancient world. Its armies marched across foreign lands. Its merchants reached distant kingdoms. Its monuments inspired admiration from travelers throughout the Near East. Few could have imagined that this extraordinary empire would one day face a challenge unlike any it had encountered before. Not from invading armies, not from failed harvests, but from a single pharaoh whose ideas would attempt to change the very foundations of Egyptian religion itself. By the middle of the new kingdom, Egypt stood at the height of its power. Its armies controlled territories stretching deep into Nubia and the Levant. Gold poured into royal treasuries, merchants carried luxury goods from distant lands, and the temples of Ammon grew richer with every successful campaign. To many Egyptians, it must have seemed that their civilization had reached a level of prosperity that could never be challenged. But history has a habit of changing course when people least expect it. The next great transformation would not begin on a battlefield. It would begin inside the royal palace itself. The man responsible was born as Amenhotep IV, the son of Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's wealthiest and most successful pharaohs. When he inherited the throne around 1353 BC, few could have imagined that his reign would become one of the most controversial in Egyptian history. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Traditional ceremonies continued. Priests performed familiar rituals. The temples remained busy with offerings to dozens of Egyptian gods. For more than 1,500 years, Egypt had worshipped an enormous pantheon of deities. Ra guided the sun across the sky. Osiris ruled the afterlife. Isis protected families. Horus watched over kingship. Ammon had become the supreme god of the empire, and his temple at Karnak had grown into one of the richest religious institutions anywhere in the ancient world. Its priests possessed enormous influence. They controlled vast agricultural estates. They employed thousands of workers. They supervised workshops, ships, warehouses, and temples across Egypt. In many ways, the wealth of Ammon's priesthood rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. Amenhotep IV soon began questioning this balance of power. Instead of focusing on Ammon, he devoted increasing attention to another deity, the Aten. Unlike the traditional gods, Aten was represented not by an animal or human figure, but by the visible disk of the sun itself. In Egyptian art, its rays extended downward, ending in tiny human hands that reached toward the earth, symbolizing life flowing from sunlight to every living thing. At first, Aten simply received greater royal attention, but over time, the changes became far more dramatic. Around the fifth year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made a decision unlike anything Egypt had ever witnessed. He changed his own name. From that moment forward, he called himself Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. The new name reflected more than personal devotion. It announced a revolution. Akhenaten declared that Aten should become Egypt's supreme divine power. The temples of Ammon gradually lost royal support. Their wealth was reduced. Many traditional religious ceremonies were abandoned. The names and images of certain gods were removed from monuments. Even the word gods sometimes disappeared from official inscriptions, replaced by references to the Aten alone. Modern historians continue debating whether Akhenaten created the world's first true monotheistic religion or simply elevated Aten above all other gods. Whatever the precise definition, his reforms represented the most radical religious transformation Egypt had ever experienced. The king did not stop there. Believing that the old religious centers remained too closely connected to the priesthood of Ammon, he founded an entirely new capital in Middle Egypt. Its ancient name was Akhetaten. Today we know the site as Amarna. Unlike Memphis or Thebes, Akhetaten had no long religious tradition. It was built specifically for Akhenaten's new vision of Egypt. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, workshops, and residential districts appeared with astonishing speed. Thousands of workers relocated to the new city, creating a thriving royal capital almost from nothing. The architecture itself reflected changing beliefs. Traditional temples had often been dark spaces filled with towering columns and enclosed sanctuaries. Akhenaten's temples looked very different. Large open courtyards allowed sunlight to flood every part of the sacred space. The Aten, after all, could only be fully honored beneath the open sky. Art changed as dramatically as religion. For centuries, Egyptian royal sculpture had followed remarkably consistent conventions. Pharaohs appeared young, strong, perfect, almost timeless. Akhenaten rejected many of these traditions. Statues and reliefs portrayed him with an unusually elongated face, narrow shoulders, wide hips, long fingers, and a rounded stomach. Members of the royal family appeared in surprisingly intimate scenes. The king kissed his daughters. Queen Nefertiti stood beside him as an equal participant in religious ceremonies. Their children played naturally beneath the rays of the Aten. These scenes feel strikingly human even today. Instead of emphasizing royal perfection alone, they offered glimpses of family life, rarely seen in earlier Egyptian art. Among all the figures of this extraordinary period, none became more famous than Nefertiti herself. Her beautifully sculpted limestone bust, discovered in 1912 within the workshop of the artist Thutmose, remains one of the most recognizable works of ancient art ever created. Although her exact political role remains uncertain, Surviving reliefs suggest that she participated actively in state ceremonies and may have exercised authority far beyond that traditionally held by Egyptian queens. For several years, Akhenaten's revolution appeared successful. The royal court supported the new religion. Construction continued at Amarna. Artists embraced the new style. Officials adapted to changing royal expectations. Yet outside the capital, the picture was less certain. Ordinary Egyptians had worshipped their traditional gods for countless generations. Every village possessed local deities. Families prayed to household gods. Festivals honoring Ammon, Osiris, Hathor, and countless others formed part of everyday life. Changing a civilization's beliefs proved far more difficult than changing a king's name. Many people likely continued practicing traditional religion quietly within their own homes. Others simply accepted the changes while waiting to see what the future would bring. Meanwhile, another problem was beginning to grow. As Akhenaten devoted enormous energy to religious reform, reports from Egypt's northern territories became increasingly troubling. Letters sent by local rulers in Canaan pleaded for military assistance against rival kingdoms and expanding enemies. Some begged repeatedly for Egyptian troops. Others warned that loyal cities were falling one after another. But the king's attention remained focused primarily on his new capital and his religious revolution. The empire that Thutmose III had built through decades of careful campaigning was beginning to weaken. And before long, both Akhenaten's new religion and his remarkable city would face a future very different from the one he had imagined. When Akhenaten died, Egypt stood at a crossroads. His ambitious religious revolution had transformed the royal court, reshaped Egyptian art, and filled the new city of Akhetaten with magnificent palaces and temples dedicated to the Aten. Yet beyond the walls of the capital, many Egyptians continued honoring the gods their ancestors had worshipped for centuries. The empire itself had begun to weaken, and the certainty that had once defined the new kingdom was slowly fading. The ruler who inherited this uncertain world was only a child. His name was Tutankhaten. At perhaps 8 or 9 years of age, the young king suddenly found himself wearing the double crown of Egypt. Like every child, he depended upon experienced advisors to guide him. But unlike any ordinary child, every decision made in his name would shape the future of one of history's greatest civilizations. Very early in his reign, one decision changed everything. The royal court abandoned Akhenaten's religious experiment. The temples of Ammon reopened. Traditional priests returned to their duties. Ancient festivals were celebrated once again. Even the young king's own name changed. Tutankhaten, the living image of the Aten, became Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of Ammon. The message could not have been clearer. Egypt was returning to its ancient traditions. The royal court gradually left Akhetaten, and the magnificent city that Akhenaten had built with such determination began to empty. Palaces that had once echoed with officials, artists, craftsmen, and priests slowly fell silent. Workshops closed. Houses were abandoned. Wind-blown sand gradually reclaimed streets that only a few years earlier had represented the future of Egypt. Today, Amarna remains one of archaeology's most valuable sites, precisely because it was abandoned so quickly. Unlike cities occupied continuously for thousands of years, Many buildings remained largely untouched after their inhabitants departed, preserving an extraordinary snapshot of daily life during one of Egypt's most unusual periods. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun ruled for only a short time. Around the age of 18 or 19, he died unexpectedly. The exact cause of his death remains uncertain even today. Over the years, researchers have suggested illness, infection, complications from injuries, genetic disorders caused by royal intermarriage, or a combination of several medical conditions. Modern CT scans and DNA studies have helped answer some questions while raising many others. Yet during his own lifetime, Tutankhamun was probably not considered one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. His reign was brief. His military achievements were limited. His building projects never matched those of rulers like Thutmose III or Ramesses II. Ironically, it was not his life that made him famous. It was his tomb. In November 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter, after years of patient searching in the Valley of the Kings, uncovered a staircase cut into the bedrock beneath the desert floor. As excavation continued, workers reached a sealed doorway bearing the royal name of Tutankhamun. When Carter finally peered through a small opening using nothing more than a candle, he later recalled hearing the famous question, "Can you see anything?" His answer has become one of archaeology's most celebrated quotations. Yes, wonderful things. Unlike nearly every other royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun's burial chamber had remained largely untouched by ancient tomb robbers. Inside lay more than 5,000 objects: golden chariots, jewelry, furniture, weapons, musical instruments, food, clothing, statues, ceremonial beds, and most famously, the magnificent solid gold funerary mask that has become one of the defining symbols of ancient Egypt itself. These treasures transformed modern understanding of Egyptian civilization. For the first time, archaeologists could study an almost complete royal burial rather than scattered fragments left behind after centuries of looting. Yet while Tutankhamun became the world's most famous pharaoh, another ruler would become Egypt's greatest builder. His name was Ramesses II. Ascending the throne around 1279 BC, Ramesses ruled for more than 66 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. During those decades, he launched military campaigns, expanded monumental construction, and filled Egypt with statues and temples bearing his own image. Few rulers understood the power of public image better than Ramesses. Across the kingdom, colossal statues portrayed him standing with calm confidence. Temple walls recorded his victories. Obelisks carried his royal titles. Even today, visitors to Egypt encounter his name almost everywhere they travel. Among his greatest architectural achievements stands Abu Simbel, carved directly into the cliffs of southern Egypt. Four enormous seated statues of Ramesses guard its entrance, each standing over 20 meters high. Twice each year, sunlight penetrates deep into the temple's interior, illuminating statues placed within its sanctuary in a remarkable demonstration of Egyptian architectural planning and astronomical knowledge. But Ramesses sought more than magnificent buildings. He also wished to preserve Egypt's influence in the Near East. That ambition led to one of antiquity's most famous battles, the Battle of Kadesh. Around 1274 BC, Egyptian and Hittite armies met near the city of Kadesh in what is now Syria. Both empires sought control over strategically important trade routes and prosperous cities. According to Egyptian inscriptions, Rameses achieved a heroic victory after personally leading his troops against overwhelming odds. Hittite records tell a rather different story. Modern historians generally conclude that neither side achieved a decisive military victory. Instead, both armies suffered heavy losses before eventually withdrawing. Yet the importance of Kadesh lies not only in the battle itself. Years later, Egypt and the Hittite Empire signed what is widely recognized as one of the world's earliest surviving international peace treaties. Rather than continuing an exhausting conflict that neither side could truly win, the two great powers agreed to respect one another's borders, assist each other against external threats, and even return political refugees under agreed conditions. Remarkably, copies of this treaty survive today in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. It reminds us that diplomacy can become as historically significant as warfare. For decades after Ramesses II, Egypt remained one of the dominant civilizations of the ancient world. Yet beyond its borders, forces were gathering that no pharaoh fully understood. Around the eastern Mediterranean, powerful kingdoms began collapsing with astonishing speed. Cities burned, trade networks disappeared, entire populations migrated in search of survival. Among these mysterious groups were the people whom Egyptian records simply called the Sea Peoples. Their exact origins remain one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Some may have come from the Aegean, others from Anatolia or different regions of the eastern Mediterranean. What united them was movement. Wherever they appeared, established kingdoms struggled to resist them. During the reign of Ramesses III, Egypt faced one of the greatest threats in its long history. Unlike previous invasions, these attackers arrived not only by land, but also by sea. Fortunately for Egypt, Ramesses III prepared carefully. His navy confronted enemy ships in the Nile Delta, while Egyptian archers rained arrows upon vessels trapped in narrow waterways. Reliefs carved into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu vividly record the battle, showing overturned ships, fierce fighting, and prisoners brought before the pharaoh. Egypt survived, but victory came at a tremendous cost. The economy weakened. Trade routes that had enriched the kingdom for centuries were disrupted. Maintaining large armies and enormous temples became increasingly expensive. The strength that had built an empire slowly began to fade. The age of the great warrior pharaohs was drawing to a close, yet ancient Egypt itself was far from finished. Its greatest political power would eventually disappear, but its monuments, beliefs, knowledge, and stories would continue inspiring generation after generation for thousands of years. Long after the last pharaoh had ruled, long after the temples had fallen silent, the civilization born beside a narrow ribbon of water flowing through the desert would continue to captivate the imagination of the entire world. Although Egypt had survived the invasions of the Sea Peoples, victory did not restore the kingdom to its former strength. The great empire built by Ahmose, Hatshepsut, and Thutmose III gradually became more difficult to maintain. Trade routes that had once brought enormous wealth into the Nile Valley were no longer as reliable as they had been for centuries. Foreign territories slipped from Egyptian control, while the cost of maintaining temples, armies, and government officials continued to rise. For ordinary Egyptians, these changes happened slowly. The Nile still flooded each year. Farmers still planted wheat and barley. Boats still carried goods along the river. Life continued. But beneath that familiar rhythm, the balance that had supported Egypt for nearly 2,000 years was beginning to shift. One of the first signs appeared inside the temples. For centuries, pharaohs had rewarded the priests of Ammon with land, livestock, gold, and valuable gifts after successful military campaigns. Every victory expanded the wealth of the temples. Every new donation increased their influence. Eventually, the temples themselves became some of the largest landowners in Egypt. They employed thousands of workers. They managed farms, workshops, fishing boats, vineyards, and warehouses. In some regions, their economic power rivaled that of the royal government. This created a difficult situation. The pharaoh remained the symbolic ruler of Egypt, but the priesthood controlled enormous resources that were increasingly independent of the palace. At the same time, local governors once again became more influential. As central authority weakened, provincial leaders often solved problems without waiting for instructions from the capital. This flexibility helped communities survive difficult years, but it also reduced the king's direct control over the country. Nature added further challenges. The Nile continued flooding, but not always with the same consistency that earlier generations had enjoyed. Some years produced abundant harvests, others brought disappointing crops. Even small variations in the flood could affect food supplies across large regions of Egypt. To prepare for difficult years, administrators relied heavily on the grain storage system that had existed since the earliest dynasties. These enormous granaries became essential to the survival of entire communities. Grain was more than food. It served as currency. Workers were often paid in grain. Taxes were collected in grain. Temple offerings included grain. Even international trade frequently depended upon grain shipments. Protecting the harvest meant protecting the kingdom itself. Meanwhile, another remarkable event was taking place. One of the world's first recorded labor strikes. Around 1159 BC, during the reign of Ramesses III, the craftsmen working at Deir el-Medina, the village whose skilled workers built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, stopped working. Their reason was surprisingly familiar. They had not received their wages. Instead of money, these craftsmen were normally paid with food, grain, beer, vegetables, clothing, and other supplies. When these payments failed to arrive on time, the workers simply refused to continue. Ancient documents preserve their words with remarkable clarity. They complained that they were hungry, that their families needed food. That promises had not been kept. Rather than responding with violence, Egyptian officials negotiated. Eventually, supplies were delivered and work resumed. This event is extraordinary. More than 3,000 years ago, ordinary workers successfully organized one of the earliest documented labor protests in human history. It reminds us that ancient Egypt was far more complex than many people imagine. Its history was not made only by kings and priests. It was also shaped by builders, craftsmen, farmers, scribes, merchants, and countless ordinary families whose lives rarely appeared in monumental inscriptions. As political authority weakened, another problem became increasingly difficult to control: tomb robbery. The magnificent royal tombs built over many centuries contained enormous quantities of gold, silver, jewelry, furniture, precious stones, and ceremonial objects. These treasures had been intended to accompany the dead into eternity, but they also tempted the living. Groups of thieves began breaking into royal tombs hidden deep within the Valley of the Kings. Some worked secretly at night. Others may even have received assistance from corrupt officials who knew the locations of sealed burial chambers. Investigations recorded on ancient papyri reveal surprisingly detailed accounts of these crimes. Suspects were questioned, witnesses testified, confessions were recorded. Some thieves admitted melting down gold objects so they could no longer be identified. Others described carefully tunneling through rock to reach burial chambers. The existence of these records tells us something important. The Egyptian government fought hard to protect its royal dead, but even the most carefully hidden tombs could not remain completely secure forever. Concern over tomb robbery eventually became so serious that priests secretly removed many royal mummies from their original burial places. Instead of leaving them inside vulnerable tombs, they reburied numerous kings together inside hidden caches deep within the mountains. Ironically, this decision helped preserve some of Egypt's greatest rulers. Without those secret reburials, the mummies of kings such as Seti I, Ramesses II, and many others might never have survived until modern times. By now, Egypt looked very different from the empire that had once ruled much of the Near East. Foreign territories had been lost. Royal authority had weakened. Economic difficulties became more common. Power was increasingly shared between the palace, regional governors, and the priesthood. Yet despite all these changes, Egyptian civilization itself remained remarkably resilient. People still believed in Ma'at. They still honored the Nile. They still worshipped their ancient gods. They still buried their dead with extraordinary care. The civilization endured, but new powers were rising beyond Egypt's borders. Kingdoms from Libya, Nubia, Assyria, and Persia were growing stronger with each passing generation. Soon, the future of Egypt would no longer be decided only by Egyptians themselves. As Egypt entered the first millennium BC, the world beyond the Nile was changing rapidly. Powerful kingdoms rose across the Near East, each competing for land, resources, and influence. For centuries, Egypt had often been the dominant power in the region. Now, for the first time in its long history, it increasingly found itself responding to the ambitions of others rather than shaping events itself. The first major challenge came from the west. Several Libyan tribes had lived along Egypt's western frontier for generations. Some traded peacefully with Egyptian communities, while others occasionally crossed the border in search of fertile land. During the later New Kingdom, many Libyans even served as soldiers within the Egyptian army. Over time, their influence continued to grow. Eventually, one Libyan military leader named Shoshenq I established himself as pharaoh around 943 BC, founding what historians call the 22nd dynasty. Although his ancestry differed from many earlier rulers, Shoshenq did not attempt to replace Egyptian traditions. Instead, he embraced them. He ruled as an Egyptian pharaoh. He honored Egyptian gods. He restored temples. He supported the priesthood. For ordinary people living along the Nile, daily life changed far less than modern history books sometimes suggest. The civilization remained unmistakably Egyptian. Its rulers had changed. Its identity had not. Farther to the south, another powerful kingdom was quietly growing. Beyond Egypt's southern frontier lay Nubia, a region that had traded with the Nile Valley for thousands of years. Gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals had long traveled north from Nubia, while Egyptian ideas, architecture, religion, and writing gradually spread southward. The relationship between the two civilizations had always been complex. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they fought, sometimes one ruled the other. By the 8th century BC, however, the balance had changed. The Nubian kingdom of Kush, centered at the city of Napata, had become strong enough to move north. Its king, Pe, believed that Egypt had become politically divided and spiritually weakened. Rather than presenting himself as a foreign conqueror, Pe described his campaign as an effort to restore proper order under the traditional gods of Egypt. His armies advanced steadily along the Nile. Many local rulers surrendered without major battles. Others resisted before eventually accepting Kushite authority. When Pe reached Memphis, Egypt once again found itself united beneath a single ruler. Ironically, this foreign king admired Egyptian civilization so deeply that he preserved many of its oldest traditions more carefully than some native dynasties had done. The Kushite pharaohs repaired temples. They revived ancient religious ceremonies. They honored Ammon with exceptional devotion. They even built pyramids of their own in Nubia, inspired by the monuments that had stood beside the Nile for nearly 2,000 years. To them, Egypt was not a civilization to be destroyed. It was one to be protected. Yet even as the Kushite rulers restored stability, another empire was expanding farther east, the Assyrians. Unlike earlier kingdoms that sought influence through diplomacy or trade, Assyria built one of history's most formidable military machines. Its armies were disciplined. Its siege engineers were unmatched. Its kings pursued expansion with relentless determination. Eventually, Egypt became impossible to ignore. In 671 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. Memphis fell. The Kushite rulers temporarily retreated south. Although they later attempted to regain control, another Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, launched additional campaigns that finally ended Kushite rule in northern Egypt. The Assyrians did not remain permanently. Their empire itself soon began to weaken under the weight of constant warfare. As Assyrian authority declined, Egyptian rulers from the city of Sais succeeded in restoring independence once again. This period, known as the 26th dynasty, is sometimes called the Sate Renaissance. The name is well deserved. Artisans deliberately looked back to the artistic styles of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Ancient religious traditions experienced renewed importance. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean. Greek merchants increasingly visited Egyptian ports, bringing new ideas and establishing prosperous communities along the Nile. One settlement in particular, Naucrates, became an important center where Greek and Egyptian cultures met through commerce rather than conquest. For a brief time, it seemed that Egypt had found stability once again, but history was moving quickly. Far to the east, another empire was rising, the Persians. Under Cambyses II, the Persian Empire expanded with astonishing speed, conquering kingdoms across Western Asia. In 525 BC, Persian forces defeated the Egyptian army at the Battle of Pelusium, opening the way toward Memphis. Egypt became a province of the vast Achaemenid Empire. Like many conquerors before them, the Persians discovered that ruling Egypt required respecting its traditions. Several Persian kings adopted the title of pharaoh. They supported certain temples. They participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies. Yet many Egyptians continued longing for independence. Over the following centuries, periods of Persian rule alternated with brief moments of Egyptian freedom. Native rulers occasionally regained the throne. Foreign armies eventually returned. The struggle seemed never-ending. And then, in 332 BC, a young king from Macedonia arrived at Egypt's borders. Unlike many earlier conquerors, he encountered remarkably little resistance. The Persian Empire was already collapsing. Many Egyptians welcomed him not as another oppressor, but as a liberator. His name was Alexander, and with his arrival, ancient Egypt was about to enter its final and perhaps most famous chapter. When Alexander of Macedon entered Egypt in 332 BC, he was only 24 years old. Yet by that point, he had already defeated one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever known. The Persian king Darius III had suffered a series of crushing defeats, and much of the Near East now lay under Alexander's control. As his army marched toward the Nile, the people of Egypt faced a decision that would shape the future of their civilization. This time, there would be no great battle. Unlike earlier invasions, Alexander's arrival was met with surprisingly little resistance. Many Egyptians had grown weary of Persian rule and viewed the young Macedonian king not as another conqueror, but as someone who might restore stability to their homeland. Cities opened their gates. Local leaders welcomed him. Priests recognized the opportunity to rebuild their relationship with a ruler willing to respect Egyptian traditions. Alexander understood something that many conquerors before him had learned only after making costly mistakes. To rule Egypt successfully, one had to respect Egypt. Rather than attempting to replace its religion, customs, or traditions, he embraced them. He visited temples, participated in religious ceremonies, and presented himself as the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt. Although he spoke Greek and came from a completely different culture, he understood that political power depended upon earning the trust of the people he now governed. One journey during his stay would become legendary. Far to the west, beyond the fertile Nile Valley, lay the Siwa Oasis, one of the most isolated places in the Egyptian desert. Hidden among palm groves and natural springs stood the famous Temple of Ammon, whose priests were believed to possess extraordinary wisdom. Crossing hundreds of kilometers of desert was no easy task. Alexander and his companions faced scorching heat, shifting sand, and endless stretches of empty wilderness before finally reaching the oasis. Ancient writers later described mysterious events during the journey. Some claimed unexpected rainfall guided the travelers. Others spoke of birds leading them across the desert. Whether these stories are historical or symbolic remains uncertain, but they reveal how quickly Alexander's life became surrounded by legend. At the Temple of Ammon, the priests welcomed him with great ceremony. Exactly what was said inside the sanctuary has never been recorded with certainty. Ancient historians offered different accounts. Some claimed the oracle greeted Alexander as the son of the god Ammon. Others suggested the conversation remained entirely private. Alexander himself never revealed the details. Whatever happened inside the temple clearly affected him deeply. From that moment forward, he increasingly embraced the idea that his rule possessed divine approval. For the Egyptians, such beliefs were not unusual. For thousands of years, pharaohs had been viewed as chosen by the gods. Alexander's visit therefore strengthened his legitimacy in the eyes of both Egyptians and his own followers. Yet perhaps his greatest contribution to Egypt did not occur inside a temple. It happened beside the Mediterranean Sea. While traveling along Egypt's northern coast, Alexander selected the location for an entirely new city. Unlike Memphis or Thebes, this city would not grow gradually over centuries. It would be carefully planned from the beginning. Its name would become one of the most famous in history, Alexandria. According to ancient tradition, Alexander himself walked across the chosen site while architects marked the city's future streets. When they ran out of chalk, soldiers reportedly used barley flour to outline the plan upon the ground. Birds quickly descended from the sky and ate the grain. Some advisors feared this was a bad omen. Others interpreted it differently. They believed the city would one day feed people from every corner of the world. Whether the story is true or not, history proved remarkably close to that prediction. Alexandria occupied an almost perfect location. Its magnificent natural harbor connected Egypt directly with the Mediterranean world. Goods arriving from Greece, Asia Minor, Cyprus, Phoenicia, and Italy could easily reach the Nile through canals and river transport. Likewise, Egyptian grain, papyrus, linen, glass, and gold could flow outward to distant markets. The city quickly became one of the busiest ports in the ancient world. Although Alexander spent only a short time in Egypt, his vision transformed the country's future. Greek soldiers settled alongside Egyptian families. Merchants speaking different languages traded in crowded marketplaces. Architects blended Greek planning with Egyptian traditions. Instead of replacing one civilization with another, Alexandria gradually became a meeting place where cultures mixed, exchanged ideas, and learned from one another. Its streets reflected this remarkable diversity. Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Phoenician merchants, Jewish scholars, Nubian traders, sailors from across the Mediterranean, all walked through the same markets and harbors. Few cities in history became so international so quickly, yet Alexander himself would never witness its greatest achievements. Only months after leaving Egypt, he continued eastward, conquering territories as far as modern-day Afghanistan and India. His victories created one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. But in 323 BC, while still only 32 years old, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon. His death shocked the world. Even more surprising was the fact that he left behind no clear adult heir capable of ruling his enormous empire. Almost immediately, his leading generals began competing for control. The empire that Alexander had built with astonishing speed soon fractured into several independent kingdoms. Egypt fell under the control of one of his most trusted commanders. His name was Ptolemy. Unlike many rulers who saw Egypt merely as conquered territory, Ptolemy chose to remain. He declared himself pharaoh. He respected Egyptian religious traditions while introducing elements of Greek culture. With him began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a royal family that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. It was a dynasty that would transform Alexandria into the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and eventually produce one final ruler whose name would become more famous than that of any pharaoh before her, Cleopatra. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt from the magnificent city of Alexandria. Although its kings and queens were descendants of Greek settlers, they quickly realized that governing Egypt required more than military strength. Like the pharaohs before them, they supported temples, honored many Egyptian religious traditions, and presented themselves as the rightful rulers of the Nile. Greek became the language of government and scholarship, while Egyptian continued to be spoken throughout the countryside. Two cultures that had once seemed very different gradually learned to exist side by side. Nowhere was this more visible than in Alexandria itself. The city continued growing until it became one of the largest urban centers in the ancient world. Wide avenues crossed one another at right angles. Elegant temples stood beside Greek theaters. Bustling harbors welcomed ships arriving from every corner of the Mediterranean. Merchants unloaded grain, papyrus, spices, wine, marble, glass, ivory, perfumes, and precious metals, while sailors spoke dozens of different languages along the crowded docks. But Alexandria became famous for something even greater than its wealth: knowledge. The Ptolemaic rulers dreamed of creating the greatest center of learning the world had ever seen. To achieve that goal, they established the legendary Library of Alexandria. Its exact size remains unknown, but ancient writers described thousands upon thousands of scrolls carefully collected from across the known world. Scholars traveled from Greece, Egypt, Persia, India, and many other lands to study mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, literature, philosophy, and history. Whenever ships entered Alexandria's harbor, officials reportedly searched for books on board. Original manuscripts were copied, with the copies often returned to their owners, while the originals remained in the library's growing collection. Whether every ancient story about the library is completely accurate no longer matters. Its reputation became immortal. For centuries, Alexandria represented humanity's greatest attempt to gather all knowledge into a single place. Nearby stood another wonder: the lighthouse of Pharaohs. Built on an island connected to the city by a massive causeway, the lighthouse rose well over 100 meters above the sea, making it one of the tallest structures ever built in the ancient world. During the day, its white stone tower guided sailors toward Alexandria's harbor. At night, a great fire burned at its summit, its light reflected by polished metal mirrors that could be seen from astonishing distances across the Mediterranean. Together, the library and the lighthouse symbolized two different forms of guidance. One helped travelers find their way across the sea. The other helped humanity find its way through knowledge. Yet while Alexandria flourished, the Mediterranean world itself was changing. Far to the west, a new power had begun expanding with extraordinary speed: Rome. What had once been a small Italian republic gradually conquered neighboring territories before extending its influence across the entire Mediterranean basin. By the 1st century BC, Rome had become the dominant political and military power of its age. Egypt remained wealthy. Its fertile farmland continued producing enormous quantities of grain. Its ports connected international trade routes. Its treasures attracted the attention of every ambitious ruler. Among the members of the Ptolemaic dynasty, one young woman understood these changing realities better than anyone else. Her name was Cleopatra VII. History often remembers Cleopatra simply as a beautiful queen. The truth is far more fascinating. She was highly educated, spoke several languages, and was one of the few members of her dynasty known to have learned the Egyptian language itself. She studied philosophy, mathematics, diplomacy, medicine, astronomy, and literature. More importantly, she possessed extraordinary political intelligence. When her father died, Cleopatra inherited the throne alongside her younger brother, according to Egyptian royal tradition. Almost immediately, conflict erupted within the royal family. Political advisors sought control. Rival factions formed. Cleopatra eventually found herself forced to leave Alexandria. For a time, it appeared that she had lost everything. Then history took another unexpected turn. In 48 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria while pursuing his rival Pompey during Rome's civil war. Cleopatra recognized an opportunity. According to one famous ancient story, she secretly entered Caesar's residence, wrapped inside a carpet or large bundle of fabric, allowing herself to be carried past the palace guards unnoticed. Whether every detail of this dramatic account is true remains uncertain. What is certain is that Cleopatra succeeded in meeting Caesar. The two quickly formed both a political alliance and a personal relationship. With Roman support, Cleopatra regained her throne. In the years that followed, she gave birth to a son known as Caesarion, whom she believed to be Julius Caesar's child. For a brief moment, it appeared that Egypt might secure its independence through diplomacy rather than war. But events in Rome changed everything once again. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated. His death plunged the Roman Republic into another civil war. Among those competing for power was Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies. When Antony met Cleopatra, another political partnership began. Like her earlier relationship with Caesar, this alliance served both personal and strategic purposes. Together, they sought to preserve Egypt's independence while strengthening Antony's position within Rome. To their enemies, however, the partnership appeared dangerous. Antony's rival, Octavian, skillfully used propaganda to convince many Romans that Antony had abandoned Roman interests in favor of an Eastern queen. The conflict eventually reached its climax in 31 BC during the Battle of Actium. Fought off the western coast of Greece, the battle became one of history's most decisive naval engagements. Octavian's fleet emerged victorious. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt. The following year, Roman forces entered Alexandria. Realizing that defeat had become inevitable, Antony took his own life. Soon afterward, Cleopatra also died. Ancient tradition claims she allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, though modern historians continue debating the exact circumstances of her death. With Cleopatra's passing in 30 BC, nearly 3,000 years of pharaohs came to an end. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. Its rulers were no longer kings born beside the Nile. They governed from Rome. Yet something remarkable happened. Although Egypt lost its political independence, it never lost its identity. Its temples continued inspiring travelers. Its monuments survived invading armies, earthquakes, floods, and the passing of countless generations. Its writing waited patiently until the Rosetta Stone allowed scholars to read hieroglyphs once more. Its pyramids remained standing while entire empires rose and disappeared around them. Today, more than 5,000 years after the first farming villages appeared beside the Nile, Ancient Egypt continues to fascinate millions of people around the world, not because it was mysterious, not because it was perfect, but because it was profoundly human. Its people searched for meaning. They built families. They faced droughts, wars, triumphs, and uncertainty. They believed that life was precious enough to be remembered long after death. The pyramids, temples, and monuments they left behind are extraordinary, but perhaps their greatest achievement was something less visible. They proved that a civilization built upon cooperation, knowledge, adaptation, and the steady rhythm of a single river could endure for more than 3,000 years and leave a legacy that still shapes our imagination today. And even now, as the waters of the Nile continue their timeless journey toward the Mediterranean, they still flow past the same deserts where one of humanity's greatest stories first began. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through history and science. If you enjoyed this peaceful exploration, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps this channel continue creating long, relaxing documentaries designed to help you unwind, learn something new, and gently drift off to sleep. If there is another fascinating mystery from history or science you would like to explore in a future episode, feel free to share your suggestion in the comments below. I always enjoy reading your ideas. And now, wherever you are in the world, I hope you can leave behind the noise of the day, slow your thoughts, and enjoy a peaceful night's rest. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next journey through history. Good night.